as hurt as badly as the rest of the world and the more developed nations. And so that's good news for our agricultural exports to that part of the world. And if we look at grain use, we're counting more and more on exports to drive, particularly in corn. We need that export market. Our domestic use in corn really hasn't increased over the last 4 or 5 years. After increasing 50% between 2005 and 2014-15, that domestic use here in this country is with maturing of the ethanol industry. We haven't seen that surge in demand on the domestic side. And if we're going to continue to see that demand growth, unless something changes domestically, we're relying more heavily on that export activity. That's in the corn market. And one thing that's driving prices in the short term higher for corn is some of the limited capability of our export competitors, particularly Ukraine. Their 2020 corn production was cut significantly in the most recent WASDE report. And even though we're seeing increased production out of Brazil and Argentina, Russia holding about the same with the crop impacts there in Ukraine, the smaller crop, particularly in corn, we're seeing less of export competition, where in Ukraine specifically, they have a very small domestic corn use industry. They're growing that for export. And so when they have a smaller crop, that certainly creates more opportunities for us here in the U.S. Another question I think now facing as we're looking ahead to 2021 is what are we going with acres? The last 2 years with the difficult situation we've had up in the Midwest, particularly, we've had a lot of prevented planting in the spring, and we're down some 8, 10, 12 million acres from where we could easily come back to in 2021. And I think we're going to see a significant rebound with corn and soybeans, given the price activity that we're seeing here, the surge of prices we're seeing here at the end of the year. And so how are we going to divide up that 10 million acres or that 12 million acres, I think is a real question. I think we'll see increases in both, but I think the increase in corn is going to be tempered considerably by $11 soybeans. So I think we're going to see higher corn and higher soybeans. And right now, if I'm sticking numbers in a balance sheet, I'm looking for an increase of just 1 or 2 million acres in corn and some 8 million acres in soybeans. Last spring, farmers said they were going to plant 97 million acres of corn. So we've got the capacity and the capability. But again, I think it's the strong soybean market that's going to be the competition for us there. But just using a number like 92 million acres and a yield of 177, and that's going to be lower than you're going to see in many early season forecasts for next year. USDA and their long-term projections, they're using a number closer to 180 or 181 for a national corn yield next year. I've got a La Nina tempered yield that I'm using, which is more just a straight line projection, but they also have fewer acres than I do. Looking at production either way, if we have lower acres and a higher yield or more acres and a lower yield, we're coming up with production right around 15 billion bushels and a supply just slightly higher than we had last year. So that brings us down to the question of what's going to happen then to demand. Are we going to see that demand picture change significantly? And I think we're likely to see the ethanol industry come back to a degree, not to where we've been the last 4 or 5 years, but coming back. And if exports stay strong, but even dial back, say 200 or 300 million bushels, I'm looking at total use next year about where we're standing in the current marketing year. Doing that with the slight production change, we've got a slight increase in ending stocks than compared to where we are in the current marketing year. And why does all that matter? Are we going to get to $5 corn? The critical feature of doing that seems to be getting that days of use on hand at the end of the marketing year below that 40-day threshold. When you drop that supply to use measure under a 40-day supply, that's when we've seen our all-time record high corn prices. We crowded that line in the November WASDE. We reset these numbers. We're down to a 42-day supply. So the question going to 2021, are we going to go to the left? We're going to go to the right. And I think with an acreage increase, even with a trend line kind of yield and steady demand, we're going to ease back to the right, not crowd that number to the left. Now, could we see higher prices between now and say March or May? If we were to get a surprise in the grain stocks report. If USDA were to lower the yield estimate for that 2020 corn crop one more time, you bet we could crowd that line. We've already tested almost 440 a bushel on that July corn contract. So we're seeing some pretty exciting pricing opportunities. But I think as we look further down to that new crop year, unless we see something significantly change on the demand side or on the production side, again, I think we're going to move back to the right on this days of use on hand and take some of that price pressure off, slightly lower prices for next year. We've had some opportunities to sell some of that next year's crop at $4. I didn't want to let that go, but I think there yet may be some better opportunities ahead of us. But I think we're at levels that, again, we need to keep our eye on the ball when it comes to marketing relative to what that price is offering you to your production cost and your break-even point for your particular farm. Still seeing that strong premium in the sorghum market, creating some great profitable opportunities there for those folks that still have some grain to sell. And again, some perspective on the continuation of that, I think is going to be very, very important that we'll hear. Strong exports of sorghum in the last marketing year. We're off to a pretty good start this year. And certainly USDA is expecting that number to be competitive with last year. And this indicates that strong premium of sorghum price minus the price of corn relative those surges that we see in exports. We've got a strong export sorghum market. That's when we see that premium relative to corn. And that's certainly what we're experiencing now. And again, look forward to hearing more about the perspective on that particular price movement. The La Nina weather pattern is expected to bottom out sometime in that December, January, the end of February timeframe, perhaps back to neutral conditions as we get to next summer. But certainly for our winter wheat or much of our southern high plains agriculture, we'll be in the grasp of that La Nina phenomenon as we pretty well wrap up the growing season for many of our South and Southeast Texas producers. So again, a factor we need to continue to watch and to be aware of. A balance sheet adjustments for corn and sorghum, just very quickly to wrap up. I think we'll see higher acres for both. Corn yield is not as impacted by the La Nina weather pattern typically because it's more of the southern impact is the highest likelihood and probabilities. So I think we'll see I'm looking for pretty well steady yield expectations for corn, but I think we could see lower average yields for sorghum, given the domination of sorghum production in Kansas and Texas. So I'm looking for higher production in corn, lower production in sorghum. Domestic use about steady, and exports, I think we'll back off a little on the corn market. And again, I'll be interested to get some perspective on sorghum exports. If we hold those steady with higher ending stocks, I think we can hold these price premiums in the sorghum market. But again, these be the critical factors holding that kind of trend that we've seen there in sorghum. Over in corn, I think our ending stocks are going higher and some degree of price pressure, not a collapse, but certainly, again, moving back to a slightly higher stocks to use ratio and a little bit more pressure on prices. But all of that, much of that depends on not only the weather, but also the pace of growth in the global economy, as well as our ability to access those markets. And affected by trade uncertainty, disputes, any kind of disruptions, positive and negative. If it's Russia limiting wheat exports, well, that's maybe good for our wheat market. Whereas if it's a difficulty of us accessing a particular market or a trade disruption that we have with the trading partner, according to that, to more of a negative situation. So that's what I brought this morning. I'd be glad to take any comments or questions as we move along, or shoot me an email or give me a call, discuss these specifically. Good to be with y'all again. And Matt and Bobby, appreciate y'all putting this together. Thank you much.
Thank you, Dr. Welch. If folks have a question, they can put it in the chat or they can unmute as we let Dr. Robinson load up his part of the presentation. And I'm looking at the chat. I don't see anything just yet. But anytime you have a question during the presentation, please don't hesitate to ask it or put it in the chat. We'll get to you. We're going to move along to Dr. John Robinson, who is our Extension Specialist for Cotton Marketing. He will be with us giving a presentation on the outlook for cotton. So we'll turn it over to you, John.
Thank you very much. Folks, just keep in mind some of the major points that Mark Welch just said about grain markets involving the La Nina influence, thinking about next year, trade-related things, pandemic impacts on the economy, and just hold all that in mind. And we'll talk about the cotton situation because they're all important. Here's a picture of the November USDA numbers in the far right column. You won't remember, or perhaps you will, but when I threw these numbers up here last month, they were pretty much unchanged from what we're seeing now. They didn't make too many changes, which was rather unexpected. November is the time where typically USDA comes in and makes an adjustment to US production because they've had enough of their own field samples, and they start to combine that with data that they get from cotton gins, the pace of ginning, and usually about this time of the year they make an adjustment. Everybody was expecting them to make an adjustment to that number there, which that's the estimate of a 17 million bale crop. They actually bumped it slightly higher this month compared to October, which was, like I said, I was personally thinking they were going to cut it 700,000 bales. Everybody I talked to in the industry is projecting a number of 16 or 16.2 or 16.3 million bales. And so we're all sitting here wondering, well, what the heck is going on? This is rather late in the game for USDA not to do anything. And it leaves me wondering, well, does that mean that there really is a lot more cotton out there than the industry folks think? Does it mean there's presumably a lot of low grade cotton? I mean, we've all been watching, I've lost count, frankly, of how many tropical storms have slammed into the Gulf Coast. Plus we've had bad weather in West Texas, starting with dryness, ending with freezes and ice storms, and just lots of reasons to think that there's less production out there. And yet we still don't see that reflected in the numbers. So it's either coming late, which will be a bit of a surprise to the market, or they're not going to cut it as much as we think, which would also be a surprise to the market. So we're wondering about that. And as the production goes, so the question of how many exportable supplies we have. Right now, they're holding it at 14.6. And I'll just project, I still think they are probably going to cut this number at least 500,000 bales, if not 600,000 or 700,000. There's people out there holding a forecast of 1 million bales fewer than this. If that was to happen, that would go down 1 million, but then they would cut the exports too by maybe half. So the real question is what's going to happen to this ending stocks number. This 7.2 million bales of ending stocks is a bearish, burdensome, historically high number. That just on the face of it, that number would call for futures prices under 60 cents. But obviously prices have been holding up a lot higher than that. So everybody's discounting what USDA is actually doing. But I'll just give the most bearish people out there, I'll say, let's cut this 1 million. This would go down maybe 500,000. This number here might drop to 16.5, 16.6, 16.7 million, which is still a historically bad, bearish, heavy sort of forecast. If this was the final number of 16.6, that would still be a recipe by the numbers for futures prices to be a lot lower than they are right now. So that's kind of the situation that we're in, and we're still waiting, and we'll see what unfolds. There has been a lot of speculative buying in the market. If you look over here to the right, here's the price rally. Prices fell in February to April because of the pandemic. They started to rise on Chinese government buying. Then they started to rise on, you can see the buildup of this green area, speculative buying. And that appears to have leveled off in the last couple of weeks. And that's when they pushed prices, spec buying pushed prices over 70 cents. We got to 72 something. And then they leveled off. They're a little bit lower. There's been a little bit of a sell-off, and now we're up here. So I would look at that and say, there's room for one more hurrah. If we finally get a late season cut in U.S. production, that might vindicate some people, that might get these guys back into a slightly bullish stance, but I just get the feeling they've sort of done most of what they're going to do. They're holding prices at these high levels, but I don't really see 73, 74, 75 cents in our future. I mean, anything can happen, but I'm not really seeing that, and I'm not seeing it from their most recent pattern of leveling off in their buying. So while we've pushed through upper resistance, we're kind of hovering back a few cents below that. The question of what they do to production is sort of tied to this question of, is there any weather market premium left in the market? Usually by this time of the year, that's gone. But like I say, there's this lingering question of, are they going to step in and cut U.S. production? And maybe, that could happen as late as December, January, because USDA FSA is going to come with some updated acreage data. They usually do at that time of the year. Sometimes it's a little surprising if they cut acreage. So this year they might cut acreage and they might trim the yield some. Again, we'll have to see. It may come in the winter. I don't think it's anybody's salvation. I don't think a late season adjustment to production is going to give us 75-cent futures. I don't think that's going to happen. It may give us another last hurrah, but I think we're seeing the prices. We've seen the prices, the best prices that have been available. We might revisit 72 or 73. And if that happens, I would consider it a selling opportunity. I wouldn't be holding and hoping for a longer sustained rally on this kind of stuff. Because the people that are fueling that rally tend to be somewhat unpredictable, and sooner or later they're going to take their profits and just step out for good. And if something was to happen to scare these guys, some unrelated thing, trade related, election related, pandemic related, something was to scare these guys and put them into profit taking, loss cutting mode, they could sell the market down 5 or 6 cents from where it is right now, just on something unexpected. So I would say take the opportunities they've given you and view them as selling opportunities. So it's thinking about the new crop situation. It's kind of colored by the same conditions that Mark Welch was talking about. Planting a whole bunch of soybeans in the Mid-South particularly, but also over in the southeastern states, the Carolinas, Virginia, that's going to take away from cotton acres. I would suggest that the price ratios are probably favoring cotton plantings toward the lower end of this range, maybe between 12 and 12.5 million acres. What's really going to be significant is that half the acres are going to be in Texas, with more in Oklahoma and Kansas. And in a La Nina situation, we typically plant more cotton, and then the abandonment rate is, 40, 50. In 2011, it was 60%. That's what happens to us during La Nina winters. So we may have less production on a planted acreage base here. That would probably cut into ending stocks 2 million bales or so, and that would be a recipe for somewhat higher prices. Of course, it's coming under tough growing conditions, so it's an opportunity depending on how you look at it or how lucky you are. If you have production to sell, the futures market might be trading in a higher range, just shifted up from where we've seen it in the last year or so. We might be shifted up 5, 6, 7 cents. So we might have lows in the futures market in the mid 60s. We might have highs to the mid 70s or even a little bit higher than that. And I would just make the same point that Mark made about his grain marketing plan. When the market is offering you, when futures are at 73 or 74 or 75, I would look at that as an opportunity to sell some, because, a lot of growers I can think of can make it work with futures at 75 cents. I would say take those opportunities when they come and don't just sit and wait and do nothing. And that'll wrap up everything I had to say. There's my contact info, and I'll take a question whenever folks want to ask it.
Thank you, John. We appreciate that this morning. If you have a question for John, please unmute yourself or put that question in the chat. And as we're waiting on folks to do that, Mr. Cleveland, we will allow you permission to upload your presentation for us, if you would. Mr. Wayne Cleveland is the executive director for Texas Grain Sorghum Producers, and I believe he's got Patrick Wade with him this morning, and I believe believe Patrick is the policy director for sorghum producers. Is that correct, Mr. Cleveland?
Yes, sir. Patrick is our director of policy. He actually knows what's going on around here any given day. So happy to have him on. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me-
No,
you
we hear
guys
you.
hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I fell off there for just a second. So I'm gonna let Patrick have most of the time here. I did want to point out this one slide for you guys, district versus traction.
I think we might have lost
versus
him.
traction. Are you guys there?
Yeah, you're cutting in and out just a little bit, Wayne.
Okay, let me close out of this real quick. I think that helps a lot. Okay, is this a little better?
Yes, sir. We can hear you. I can hear you.
So I'll just go over this one slide. Just referencing China, I think there's some things you need to look at and some things you don't need to look at. On the left are distractions of politics, Baijiu, and trade deal. Certainly you guys are familiar with all the politics going on there. They're a lot less important than the things that are on the right side in the traction. The Baijiu, we think that's 15 to 20% of the market. That is not what's running up the price of grain sorghum right now. It's a premium there, but China needs all the feed grains it can get right now. Its Baijiu market is large. It's the most consumed liquor in the world, just because China has such a large population. But that is not why they're doing what they're doing to our market. And the last is a trade deal. Despite your politics or your leanings, sorghum, the word grain sorghum is never mentioned in the trade deal with China. We are one of the few commodities that was left out. We think that's a good thing. We think that the ambassador told us that's a good thing. So when you see trade deal, and Patrick will talk about this a little bit more, sorghum is not in there. So we're not obligated one way or the other to buy or sell grain sorghum. What I would pay attention to that gets a lot of traction is the tariff rate quotas. Sorghum has 0 tariff rate quota in China. We can send in as much grain sorghum as we want. There's no TRQ. Corn, in sharp contrast, has a TRQ out there at about 7 million. After that, the tariff goes up to about 50%. So they're somewhat limited in what they can do. The internal China farm policy. Today, if you're a Chinese producer, you can sell corn for $9 a bushel. That is all due to their internal policies. It is still cheaper to export grain sorghum from the United States to southern China than it is to buy grain sorghum in northern China and ship it to southern China. The second is a middle class growth. Mark had some good statistics there. It is phenomenal. I'll just leave it at that. As they move out of eating a starch diet and into an animal protein diet, that's critical. Keep your eyes on that. Again, African swine fever, it wiped out 50% of their swine population. That's equivalent to every pig in North America. Our consultant there tells us they're about 80% back up to speed, which leaves them another 20%. They want to move beyond that. So they're moving quickly to build that back up. So that equates more grain. This is not just corn, it's sorghum. It's corn, sorghum, all grains. And the last is soil conditions. Every time we go to China, there is always the concern about soil quality in China and their ability, not their ability, but what's happening with their production rates is commensurate with their soil condition. They do not have good dirt there. They are for the most part, 80% rugged terrain that's non-arable. So I would keep my eye on all of those things, less on the left and more on the right. And if those things on the right change, I'd sure pay attention to the market. I'm gonna bum out here, stop sharing, and I'll let Patrick take over. He's got some better statistics on just grain production in China and what that might mean to the market.
All right. Thanks, Wayne. Can y'all hear me now?
Yes, sir. Hear you fine. Thank you.
Fantastic. All right. Let me get this screen share going. Do I have I think so. Let's see. All right. That popping up there?
Yes, it is. We see it.
Wonderful. All righty. So as Wayne said, I'm Patrick Wade. I work with Wayne here at Texas Sorghum. Just a tiny bit of background. I was brought on in 2015, which is a year of a lot of importance that I'll get to here in a second. Brought on in 2015, mostly to work here in Austin on state legislative issues from that side of policy, from the legislative side of policy. But as we all know, trade policy over these last 5 years has really become a lot more important for the sorghum industry and driving a lot of the sort of basic economics for our growers. So in turn, I've kind of refocused a lot of my energy on trade and trade policy issues. I have the privilege of representing Texas Sorghum and really all of the sorghum industry on the Agricultural Technical Advisory Committee for Trade Policy and Grains, Feeds, Oilseeds, and Planting Seeds. So I got a chance to work with the Office of the United States Trade Representative to set negotiating objectives for future free trade agreements and evaluate sort of the ongoing success of our existing free trade agreements from the perspective of sorghum producers and our sorghum industry. And just general try to kind of keep an eye on trade policy challenges as they emerge and sort of give the perspective of the sorghum growers with those trade agreements. So with that context, I just want to point out that if this is, an area that y'all want to get some more information on, and anyone listening on the call is interested in sort of getting more of the week to week or month to month updates about trade in the sorghum industry, I'd encourage y'all. We're trying to sort of take the perspective that we have by working with this ATAC committee and stepping up our, really years now of trade policy work by trying to communicate that more transparently to our members and anyone who's interested. So we send out weekly, commentary on export sales reports, as well as keeping track of in general sales to China. And then monthly, we try to take a really deep dive into the kind of the minutia of trade policy. Back in January, for example, we kind of, popped open the hood and took a look at what was publicly available within the phase 1 agreement, what the text really said. Of course, the purchasing requirements were never made public, but everything else in there about the regulatory changes, the structural changes to China, all of that we took a look at. Last month, there's a screenshot of it. With October, we took a look at the different methodologies for evaluating phase 1. A think tank in Washington, D.C. had a different one than USTR. So trying to take a look at those different competing methodologies. Anyway, I just want to give a plug here at the beginning. Y'all can email me at patrick@texassorghum.org, and I'll add y'all to any of the lists that you're interested in, or you can just go find us. If you're like me, you can go find us on Twitter at Texas Sorghum. We try to tweet out links and have a link to subscribe there as well. So let's just take a quick look before we get into how things are going now. I wanted to give a couple of sort of baseline references to make here for kind of what we can look at as far as what we consider really normal trading with China to look like, and kind of how things have looked historically. Here are your basics for sorghum over the 21st century. A couple of dates here I look at on the left table here that has just the basics of production as well as price. Is look at that 2015 year. That's the target year. That was the best selling year that we had to China when they entered the market in 2013 and were there until, the trade disruptions, trade war started in 2018. That 2015 year, and as Dr. Welch pointed to, in his chart of sorghum prices at a premium, that was when it was sorghum was 40 cents over corn that year. There were near 3 million more acres planted that year than there were this year. And 200 million more bushels planted. Right now, though, we're looking at sorghum prices, are roughly at right now what they were back, at least for this marketing year. These are all marketing year average prices, I should say, and they're all from USDA numbers, except for some stuff later that I'll mention is cited from some other sources. You're seeing prices right now about where they were in 2015 in some regards, I think with some room to grow as well, as Dr. Welch pointed out, with a good premium over corn. So that's just, kind of the basics of where we've been. Exports have played an increasingly important role in driving sorghum profitability and driving prices for sorghum growers across the country. So you can look here at before China entered the market in that top chart, the share of exports, the total production was for sorghum in the US was about 30-45%, most of it going to Mexico, some going to Japan. Some EU nations kind of coming and going from the market. Countries like Spain would pop in for a few years and buy a lot and then dip back out. You can see that in the top chart there, with the share they played. And then in 2013, when China entered the market, exports became a significantly more, nearly 2/3 of total production started going towards exports. So you look at that role of how important exports have been, and how much they began to dominate demand for sorghum, and then compare that to this 2020 marketing year. I'm sorry, the 2019-2020 marketing year right there at the bottom. What we saw this calendar year basically was that, again, about 2/3 of total sorghum production has gone to exports this year. What does that look like from China's perspective? They are the ones driving that completely. So you look at those numbers there, and they started in 2013. It was about a quarter of all of these exports were going to China. They just kind of dipped their toes in the market. But from then on, I mean, like 89, 93, 82%, 83%, they were buying almost all the exported commodities, almost all the export sorghum. And again, most of the sorghum was being exported. So you're looking again, this marketing year, 2019, 2020, down there at the bottom, almost all the exports, again, going to China. So a lot of this is starting to resemble how it looked, again, during the sort of normal trading years with China. They're driving exports. Exports are becoming a huge part of production, and most of them are going to China. So just to review here, sort of how it's looked over the 21st century. Here's your production. Here's the amount of that production that was exported. And then there's kind of how price ebbed and flowed from there. Of course, like all commodities, sorghum has seen some price challenges this decade as, general production of grain across the world has risen, and there's been some demand challenges. But I think you could argue that China's really given us a good floor, a good baseline for the price to stay at. And as long as China's buying, you're not going to see sorghum prices, drop too precipitously. So again, I would point out that 2015 year in there as a really good reference point for what this market can be and what those prices can be. And like Dr. Welch said, nearly a 40-cent premium over corn that year for sorghum. So what does this look like from China's side, and what drives them to make these purchases? So first of all, in terms of the cereal grain that China buys, that's that green line there, corresponds to the axis on the right side. That's billions of bushels. That's China's feed grain demand. So, I mean, they have other, food demand as well, that a lot more wheat and some corn and rice goes to. But from a feed perspective, mostly for their swine and ducks, you're looking at that trend line going there around 7-8 billion bushels. As far as how they meet that from a sorghum perspective, it is almost all from the United States. You can see again there, this also is a good sort of indicator of sometimes how wonky China's numbers reporting can be. I'll touch on this again in a bit later. But you see some years where it says they imported more sorghum from the US than they did total. I mean, I think that you can argue they're just kind of moving grain around, or sometimes their numbers are just a little wonky like that. And they have been for reporting on phase 1 as well, which I'll get to in a second. But you look at, they meet almost all their feed demand from a sorghum perspective from the US. On a food side, some of that baijiu that Wayne talked about, they used to like to source the sorghum they need for that from Australia. They're currently in the middle of another one of those kind of anti-dumping, countervailing duty trade tit for tat with Australia right now over barley that has also shut down a lot of the sorghum exports there. So there's room to grow for the US in that regard as well. And I'll touch on some of those other countries that can export there. But again, most all the sorghum that they import comes from the US. Overall grain over this last decade, so their domestic corn production is that blue in the background, again, in the scale of billions of bushels, around 10, 11 billion bushels produced of corn domestically. I mean, they are an enormous producer of corn because they have an enormous consumption of grain in general. So here's, I mean, as Wayne mentioned, they have TRQ, tariff rate quota for corn, which I'll get to get more detail in a second, but basically that's kept a pretty low ceiling on the corn they brought in from the US relative to the sorghum they brought in over this decade from the US. Plays a significant role in terms of grain and cereal feeding that they get, from the United States. So here's how it's kind of looked over this decade. Of course, you can see the amount of corn they're on the books to buy this year from the US is an enormous amount. It is an interesting development, and I think it certainly represents the amount of demands that China has for a lot of feed. Whether or not they're able to make the structural changes to allow that level of US corn to come in consistently, though, is something worth looking at. And one of the reasons that they've been buying so much of that sorghum over this decade relative to corn, and one of the challenges that really still exists for corn looking forward, are some of these reasons here. So, I mean, to a small degree, there's a preference that some Chinese buyers, especially some with ducks, might have for nutritional side of things. You know, anecdotally, it makes gizzard fat bigger, but mostly this is economics that drives sorghum into China. And like Wayne said, there's no TRQ, there's no GMOs. They have some GMO certificates that are required to get for products that have, you know, for GM products. And then it's cheaper to bring in U.S. sorghum all the way, you know, imported across the Pacific than it is to, like Wayne said, rail it in from North China. So looking at some of these numbers here, with the TRQs, it's a 7.2 million metric ton TRQ for corn. If you're within that 7.2 million metric tons, you will get a 1% tariff. But if you're out of that 7.2, it's a 65% tariff. One of the challenges to this phase one agreement has been that, so there were, well, actually, I'll get to that in a second. I'm gonna finish up talking here, and then I'll talk about some of the phase one stuff. So TRQ has kept a pretty low ceiling on some of these corn imports. And then this is borrowed from a slide from Dr. Gary Mao, president of Northwest Grains up in Minnesota. This was a few months ago, so these aren't the exact numbers right now, but essentially, you know, it was about $270 per metric ton of U.S. sorghum versus Chinese corn was about 300 metric tons coming in from the north. So a pretty significant price advantage that translates both to our growers here in the U.S. And still, you know, is an advantage for buyers in China as well. So it's working for both sides. So let's look at phase one here, and then I'll wrap up talking about phase one. So trying to evaluate how it's going. We've all seen this conversation. You know, is phase one living up to its purchasing obligations? This is from a USTR report from a month or two ago, trying to make sense of sales to phase one. You can see sorghum there on the right. Has in a lot of ways, at least, you know, in terms of purchases committed to, not necessarily exports realized yet. Purchases, we're doing great. We're outstripping the 2017 pace of about $800 million worth of sorghum sales. Some other commodities, some other non-ag commodities are seeing some challenges. But in general, it's hard to argue with the fact that things are back to normal with U.S. sorghum moving in to China. This is just a slide to point out, like I referenced, there can be some discrepancies between the numbers China reported and the numbers the U.S. reported. As you can see, China wants to say that they have paid more for U.S. products, even though they might not have imported the same volume, and the U.S. has it the other way around, trying to say you haven't paid enough yet, you know, but you certainly brought in more sales. One of the things that excites us about phase one, though, is early in August, you know, we're seeing these huge weekly sales. So early in August, China made its fourth official largest purchase of U.S. sorghum. And if you include all the commitments for this year and the next marketing year, it's actually the largest 1 week sale of sorghum ever. So before that, that's breaking a lot of records from that 2015 year, when we were saying we saw a ton of growth and really high peaks realized of sorghum sales to China. We're starting to see weekly sales this fall that are resembling that as well. This is also the earliest in all of China's history of buying U.S. sorghum that they've been on the books to make a purchase for the next marketing year. They've already got commitments down for the 2021-2022 marketing year. This is the kind of stuff that we'll send out weekly as far as what the sales are doing week to week. So you can just, we're happy to send that out to y'all. So here you go. This is the last slide or two I have here, and this is sort of our perspective looking ahead. China's sorghum purchases are not due to phase one. As Wayne said, we're not mentioning the structural changes part of the agreement. There are some purchase requirements for every commodity listed, but nothing within phase one is about changing import protocols to allow for more sorghum to come in. And that's because there's no real non-tariff barriers restricting U.S. sorghum access to China. That's not true for all commodities, though. So China's done a pretty good job of meeting its structural changes. They've done 50 of the 57 structural changes to agricultural import protocols requested in phase one. But two of the ones they've lagged on are reforming their TRQ process. Again, that 7.2 million ton TRQ for corn has not been liberalized at all. There's also some requests in phase one for them to make it even between state-owned facilities and private facilities. They haven't really made any changes there, nor have they made any changes as far as allocating all those TRQ certificates at the beginning of the marketing year. Those are all changes that were requested and they've lagged on, as well as biotechnology approvals. So again, the GM side of things continues to work in sorghum's advantage here. And phase one is a 2-year managed trade agreement. It's not a free trade agreement that just relies on kind of free market economic principles. It's a very managed agreement with very specific requests in there. So we're still seeing sorghum continue to move just based on free market economics. That will continue beyond the 2-year lifespan of phase one. So here's just a couple of things that we're thinking about looking forward. Wayne touched on a lot of these already. So, and Dr. Welch did as well, as far as increased Chinese demand, increased numbers for projected exports. So we'll leave it here. I think these are some of the things that we're thinking about, certainly. And some of the stuff that we're going to try to continue to explain to our growers and to our members, and anyone who wants to sort of keep this conversation going with us. I think I've more than taken my time here, so I'll go ahead and stop here and leave it at that. But thanks for letting me speak to y'all this morning.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. Great information. Certainly lots of information as well. Thank you to Wayne, and thank you to all the presenters this morning. Tons of useful information. If you have a question before we end the meeting this morning, please put it in the chat or unmute yourself or whatever you want to do. And always too, you can reach out to these folks one-on-one via email. I think all of them put their contact information up for you this morning. We greatly appreciate our guests this morning to bring you this great information. We will have the next Zoom update on December the 16th at 7 o'clock in the morning for those folks that are regular attendees. It's also being recorded, and we will send that out to producers along the way as well. So if there are no questions or any comments from anybody, we will say good morning to everybody and have a wonderful day. Thank you for your time and attendance. We want to thank our sponsors again that bring this to us, the Cotton Board, Texas Corn Producers, and Texas Sorghum for providing the resources for us to do it. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you next month.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Patrick. Great info, man.
Thanks talking to y'all. Yeah,
thank y'all. Greatly appreciated.
Take care, y'all.
Bye-bye. We good, Bob?
Yes, sir. Good program.
Okay. Very good. It's going to be, I didn't hit as you know, hit the record it right at the time. So it'll be just at the very beginning of Mark's talk, but we got 90% of it. That's good information this morning, man.
Yeah, no, it's, if you're in the business, that kind of information to me is a valuable info going forward.
Absolutely.
Kind of
Absolutely.
helps you with those decisions. And
yep, for sure.
I think it's good stuff.
Okay, man, I got to get moving. We'll see you later.
All right. So you're not going to come join us today, huh?
I've got to work on another online event that's coming up for me, so I can't do it. I'd like to, put it that way. It's a great day to do it. I'll say that.
Hey, it'll be there tomorrow.
It'll be there tomorrow. Yeah, I know.
You got to take those advantages of those days.
How many of y'all got playing?
I don't know, roughly 16 to 20. You know how these people are. There'll be some that don't show up and some that didn't sign up show up. So you might as well just jump in and come on.
Yeah, well, maybe next time, man.
Oh, come on. Go get them. Go get them and let's go.
All right, let me think about it.
Montemore, I don't know, several comments. So
sounds like a fun one, man. Take care, Bob. We'll see you.
all right, have a good one.
Bye-bye.